Thus, for example, in the cavity of the old house of tribute in the platform of the chain, 65 bars of gold. According to researchers, the total hoard would have amounted to some 65 tons of silver and perhaps 26 of gold. To this day, there is some argument as to whether the treasure ever in fact existed. Most scholars, however, are prepared to accept that it did, and that the scroll comprises an accurate inventory of the Temple of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, the locations indicated by the scroll have been rendered meaningless by time, change, and course of 2 millennia, and nothing of the treasure has ever been found. A number of people certainly have searched for it. In September 1952, 6 months after the official survey, there surfaced a new source of scrolls. It proved to be a cave within some 50 feet of the actual ruins of Qumran, which DeVoe and Harding had excavated in 1951. Here, at the site demarcated Cave 4, the largest discovery of all was made, again, predictably, by the Bedouin. Some years would be required to piece this material together. By 1959, however, most of the fragments had been organized. The work was conducted in a large room which came to be known as the Scrollery in the Rockefeller Museum. The Rockefeller Museum, or to give it its official name, the Palestine Archaeological Museum, had first opened in 1938 during the British Mandate and was built from the funds donated by John D. Rockefeller. It contained not only exhibition space but also laboratories, photographic darkrooms, and the offices of the Department of Antiquities. Shortly before the mandate ended in 1948, the museum had then turned over an international board of trustees. This board was made up of representatives of the various foreign archaeological schools in Jerusalem. The French École Biblique, for example, the American Albright Institute, the British Palestine Exploration Society. For 18 years, the Rockefeller was to exist as an independently endowed institution. It managed to retain this status even through the Suez Crisis of 1956, when many of its staff were recalled to their home countries. The only casualties of the crisis were Gerald Lancaster Harding, dismissed from his post as director of the Department of Antiquities, and the scrolls themselves. During hostilities, they were removed from the museum, placed into 36 cases, and locked up in a bank in Amman. They were not returned to Jerusalem until March 1957, some of them slightly moldy, seek, and spotted from the damp vault. In 1966, however, the Rockefeller, with the scrolls it contained, was officially nationalized by the Jordanian government. This move was to have important repercussions. It was also of questionable legality. The museum's board of trustees did not object, however. On the contrary, the president of the board transferred the museum's endowment fund from London, where it had been invested, to Amman. Thus the scrolls and the museum housing them became in effect Jordanian property. A year later, the Middle East erupted in the Six-Day War, and Jordanian East Jerusalem fell to Israeli troops. At 5 o'clock on the morning of 6 of June 1967, Yigal Yadin was informed that the museum had been occupied by an Israeli paratroop unit. After becoming, in 1949, Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, Yadin had resigned in 1952 and studied archaeology at Hebrew University, earning his Ph.D. in 1955 with a thesis on one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That year, he began teaching at Hebrew University. In 1954, he had traveled to the USA on a lecture tour. There, after speaking at Johns Hopkins University, he met Professor William F. Albright and asked why the American had published only 3 of the Metropolitan Samuel IV scrolls. Albright replied that Samuel was anxious to sell the scrolls and would not allow the 4th to be published until a purchaser had been found for all of them. Could a purchaser not be found in the States? Yadin asked. Surely a few $1,000,000 for such a purchase is not too difficult to raise. Albright's reply was astonishing. The scrolls, he said, would probably sell for as little as $500,000. Even so, however, no American institution or individual appeared to be interested. There were, in fact, 2 reasons for this apparent apathy. In the first place, facsimile editions of the first 3 scrolls had already been produced, and this, for most American researchers, obviated the need for the originals. More significant, however, was the legal status of the scroll's ownership. The Jordanian government had branded Metropolitan Samuel a smuggler and a traitor, claiming he had no right to take the scrolls out of Jordan, and the Americans, by virtue of publishing the contraband text, were accused of collusion in the crime. This, needless to say, deterred prospective purchasers who had no desire to lay out substantial sum of money only to find themselves embroiled in complex international litigation and quite possibly end up with nothing. Yadin, on the other hand, had no need to fear the Jordanians. Relations between his country and theirs couldn't possibly sink any lower. On the 1st of June, Yadin was telephoned by an Israeli journalist stationed in the States who called the advertisement in the Wall Street Journal to his attention. Yadin resolved immediately to obtain the scrolls, but recognized that a direct approach might jeopardize everything. In consequence, he worked almost entirely through intermediaries, and it was a New York banker who replied to the advertisement. A meeting was arranged for the 11th of June, 1954. A price of $250,000 for the 4 scrolls was agreed on, and a wealthy benefactor found to provide the requisite money. After a number of frustrating delays, the transaction was completed at the Waldorf Astoria on the 1st of July. Among those present was a distinguished scholar, Professor Harry Orlinsky, whose role was to ensure the scrolls were indeed genuine. In order to conceal any Israeli or Jewish interest in the deal, Orlinsky introduced himself as Mr. Green. The next day, 2nd of July, the scrolls were removed from the vault of the Waldorf Astoria and taken to the Israeli consulate in New York. Each scroll was then sent to Israel separately. Yadin returned home by ship, and a code was arranged to keep him informed of each scroll's safe arrival. Details of the transaction were kept secret for another 7 months. Not until the 13th of February, 1955, did a press release reveal that Israel had acquired the 4 scrolls of Metropolitan Samuel, along with the 3 scrolls previously purchased by Sukenik, and they are in the shrine of the book, which was established specifically to house them. By the end of 1954, then, there were 2 entirely separate bodies of scroll material, and 2 entirely separate cadres of experts working with them. In West Jerusalem, there were the Israelis addressing themselves to the scrolls acquired by Sukenik and Yadin. In East Jerusalem, at the Rockefeller, there was a team of international scholars operating under the direction of DeVoe. Neither group communicated with the other. Neither had any contact with the other. Neither knew what the other possessed or what the other was doing, except for what leaked out in scholarly journals. In several instances, specific texts were fragmented, some pieces being in Israeli hands, some at the Rockefeller, which made it, of course, that the much more difficult to obtain any sense of the whole. So ridiculous was the situation that certain individuals were tempted to do something about it. Former Major General Ariel Sharon reported that in the late 1950s, he and Moshe Dayan devised a plan for an underground raid on the Rockefeller to be conducted through Jerusalem's sewer system. The plan, needless to say, was never implemented. Now, however, in 1967, hearing of the capture of the Rockefeller, Yadin immediately dispatched 3 colleagues from Hebrew University to ensure that the scrolls were safe. He recognized the implications of what had happened. Because the Rockefeller Museum was no longer an international institution, but a Jordanian one, it would pass into Israeli hands as a spoil of war. End of chapter 1.